Well, welcome, MicroGiants, to another session with the today for Consulting Amigos. We're here together to talk a little bit about tariffs and what that means for small business. So we hope we can give you at least some fruit for thought today. As you know, it's a really tough situation, and as we all are distinctly aware, it's a moving object. And so what we have is not that easy to deal with under any circumstances. So I thought we'd just open with a couple of comments here, just about this huge, I've called it a trade discordance. And today we're a day later than the very first agreement with England, and Trump is all terrific about it. It sounds like England is okay with it too. Um, we've been good trading partners for decades. And so some people may think it's not that big a deal. However, if you happen to be an American auto company, you think it's a really big deal. Um, John and I have traveled over to England in the last couple of years, and you don't find any cars that from America. That's a really unusual thing, and it's kind of like, well, why? Why is that? Why do you have cars from around the world, but in Britain? But you don't see very many American cars. And that's because there are big tariffs on it and keeps them out. When I was there 40 years ago, you used to see English Fords running all over the place, but they were manufactured in England. Ford manufactured them in England, and they sold very, very well, but they're gone. So things have changed a lot in the last 30, 40 years, and we haven't had very much change until all of a sudden. So let's just briefly, for those of you who don't have a sense for it, I thought I'd talk about some of the effects. This isn't all of the effects, but these are some of the effects, and I will admit to you that this is from Chat GPT. So this is what Chat thinks are the effects, and of course it's looking all over the internet to try and find this stuff. And these are basic things. It doesn't apply necessarily to the last few days. And of course, the general thought is that tariffs increase the cost of imported goods. Well, yeah, you if you have a base price of $10 and you've got a 10% tariff, now that's $11. So there's the increase. So what happens? Well, when you are on the recipient of that and you're now paying $11, and if you're a retailer, you're going to mark that to say $22, depending on, from maybe 18 to $23. So depending on the kind of store you are and the goods, that would, if you'd use your standard markup process, that would increase the cost to the consumer. It also causes some reshoring. We've been talking about this in manufacturing for some time. And it's been heavy the last 2 years, but reshoring is a term that probably showed up, 10 years ago. The idea of trying to bring some of our businesses, the manufacture back to us in this country, for a variety of supply chain issues. Um, it causes some to redesign products. In other words, if you have a very specific kind of an issue, like you can't bring any red widgets in, and that's the tariff says no red, then they'll change the color to get around it. I don't see that happening too much. John, you might consider that when we talk a little bit about electronics in China and so forth as an area of your expertise. So you redesign them so that they can get around the tariffs. There's going to be a lot of that. There is an example down below is that when tariffs go up, a lot of companies moved their production to Southern Asia. When we did, uh, when we began trading with Mexico and Canada under Clinton, and the special arrangements that were made there in NAFTA, a lot of people shifted their production to Mexico. So those are some of the things that can happen. So what are the primary changes? And I really boiled this down to basic stuff. And well, global trade relationships can really change. Now, ours just got better with England. I don't know if they're going to be any better with Europe. It doesn't feel like they're better with China. So, you do have a lot of changing relationships there. Huge market volatility. I don't know. I don't feel like we've had a lot of volatility quite yet. I think that's probably because we're not in the trenches, unless we've got some clients that are in the middle of this. But there usually is a lot of volatility, and I have got to bet it's going to increase a lot. Of course, we've mentioned price increases. Competitive shifting, I think, is something that we want to kind of focus on a little bit, because there are shifts that change the direction or the thrust of a particular product. So just a quick illustration on quick illustration on that. If we take a look at this particular chart, which is supply and demand, and I'm going to put the link in here down below, because this is from a video called Supply and Demand in 8 Minutes. It's an excellent video that is way more in depth and clear than what I'm going to be able to present to you now. Basically, we have supply and demand. So the demand curve, and in this case, it's a straight line. Here's the demand line, and here's the supply line. And what this means is that as prices fluctuate, you have changes in one or the other or both of supply and demand. And so things tend to change. And so if you have, for instance, a reduction in supply, which is about what's going to happen, what can happen is that we go from this equilibrium to, say, maybe up here, so that the price just went from $6 to $7 or 600 to 700. So this is what happens just with economics. This has very little to do with the tariff itself. The tariff raises the price, but if the price is high enough, it changes the demand and or the supply lines, and the equilibrium changes. And so you just have all kinds of issues going on. So I'd sort of like to take a couple minutes, guys, and talk a little bit about some of these competitive shifts in the pricing, and how
Could I
can
offer just a
these
couple of
things be?
side comments before we get into that?
Yeah, sure.
So, first of all, the term tariff, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, is directly and equal to tax. It's a tax. So we like to make it sound like it's a tariff and that's a nice thing, but really it's a tax. So the second part of that is who gets the money? Does the supplier get the money? Does the buyer get the money? Who gets the money? I think we all know who gets the money. Who gets the money?
The government gets the money.
The government gets the money.
Yeah.
So, okay, so now there's a 30, 40% tax or tariff, to use the politically correct term, that is going to the government. Now, the other side of this, and it's not being political, it's a very blunt force object. If you're trying to create manufacturing in a particular country, say, for example, in the US, you can put a high tariff or tax on stuff coming in that is competitive to the product you want to give an incentive to. Well, the alternative to doing this is forget the tariff, forget the taxes. Why don't you actually put incentives by way of tax rebates, purchase incentives, etc., on the actual product? And if you think about this over the last 10 years, this has been done by several governments. They put
Oh,
huge incentives on various industries. But the thing about incentives is they can be highly sculpted to be very specific for certain industries. The thing about tariffs, taxes, is they're a blunt force object with an aim to get some result, but there's no guarantee, and there will be collateral damage alongside. And then the other thing is, one of the slides said there was price increases. That's not always the case. I would argue that it's actually price changing is the case. If you drop a price or tariff back drastically, supposedly that's happened with Britain, then there's going to be a price decrease.
Yeah, you're
And
right.
then the last thing, just a point of correction. I don't want to correct you, Mr. Burgess, but
Yeah, be
you
careful.
did say something about we're now England and America are now in a better situation they were. I heard some analysis that actually that's not true. We're actually in a worse situation with trade with England than we were under the previous administration before the tariffs were put on. But after the tariffs were put on, we're now in a better situation than that. But we're not back to the equality we were prior to the tariffs. So it's presented as we're in a good place now, but the reality is we're actually not back to where we were. So
Well,
there's
see,
a lot of posturing with this.
that's a debatable subject, and I've seen them on both sides, and much of the time that's politically motivated. It's very
Sure, it is.
difficult.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Agreed.
So so I think that's why we want to focus on, well, okay, maybe it's fair, maybe it's not fair, maybe it's a tax, maybe it's just a cost increase. Whatever it is, what do businesses do? That's what
Fair
that's the
enough.
key here. And so years and years ago when I was in the retail business, and I used to buy some stuff direct back when importing was not done very much, I ran into issues like this. And, you say, well, I want to buy such and such. And then they go, okay, well, that's fine. But, by the way, there's a fee. Well, what is that? Or is it a tariff? And there's all kinds of stuff that creeps up depending on who's making the rules at any given time. And you've got South Africa with a whole bunch of tariffs or costs, and you've got Italy with a lot of them, and then maybe Britain had less. So what happens there is that the buyer is not focused on international relations. The buyer is what is my cost for this item? That's all they worry about. And when can I get it? Okay.
He's got a supply chain and
That's
he's
right.
got a demand. So he's just got
Yeah.
to meet that demand.
And so the question then is, well, okay, can the price go up or can it go down? Will it affect my business? And of course, the answer is, well, generally speaking, and this is not always true, generally speaking, we tend to think that the prices will go up. But there are studies out there that show that many times the prices don't go up just because there's a tariff. And the reason is because of this principle in economics called, um, um, which is really substitution. And that is that if I buy a certain product that is from Italy and I can get it from Yugoslavia, I mean, I've been there, done this, and it's like the same basic product and the price is a little less, it's like I just automatically make that shift. Italy loses, Yugoslavia wins. I end up not having to raise the price. Now, some people would say, "Oh, the product's inferior," or all of that kind of stuff. But the point there is that you can maneuver around and find ways to mitigate any of these issues. And then the other side of that is that you have, and nobody talks about this, certain products have branding strength that allows them to charge whatever the price is. And so it's like, you want to buy a certain favorite electronic thing that you enjoy. Are you going to stop buying it? Yeah,
So that
probably
that
not.
gets back into you referenced previous industry knowledge in the electronics industry. So we were involved with negotiating contracts, many contracts over a period of a year. And so most of the contracts that get put into production, whether it's making your LED sets for dashboard assemblies or dash assemblies, or whether it's a computer that controls the backup cameras. All these things are for a model year. And so you end up with a purchase agreement that will be in general terms for a period of 12 months, 10 months, whatever it happens to be. And it will be hundreds of thousands of products over that period of time because they don't want to change the design during that year. They're expecting the same format, weight, quality of the product, and they're going to some extent, attempt to do it. Now, you can do that when you have a stable price uh, basis and a stable manufacturing environment. In the current environment, I would beg to say that, where you've got parts that are coming in, with some component parts are from Mexico, some of them are core products from China coming in for it, got some from Europe. How are you going to guarantee the price of those parts over a period of 12 months?
Mm.
At this point, the chances of doing that, I would say, would be less than 20%. So what do you end up doing? You end up negotiating smaller term contracts for smaller periods of time based on what it is you can commit the next guy down the road for. Because you
Mhm.
can only commit for what your supply chain can commit to.
Mhm.
So we end up with modified chaos, but we can say we can deal with that. Well, let's just say a more volatile negotiation environment. Now, the one that is, I think, most volatile over the years has been when you have a rare earth material that fluctuates on a daily balance that you then buy on a spot market. And I'm referring to gold in this matter. There was a time when most connectors that are used in the automotive and the telecom area had gold plating on them. So we would end up negotiating contracts for the product, for the phenolic, for the metal, for the manufacturing that would be fixed for 12 months. But there would be a cost adjustment based on the time of shipping, based on whatever the current gold price was. And it was completely up in the air. It would be, we agreed at the gold standard of that time, plus or minus 20% or whatever it was. And there would be an adder that could be 5 or 10% of the value of the product. So each time a product shipped on monthly agreements, and these are, hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars, they would then adjust that price. Well, we haven't come to that, I think, in this particular market, but that is where you end up. If the tariffs are on, they're off. Oh, next week they're on again. Now they're off. I mean, where are we going here? So that's where the chaos comes in.
Let me bring in something from Forbes that I just picked up. Um, Eric Groves, who's the co-founder of Alignable, it's 9,000 small businesses, did a survey on his people, and 44% of the small businesses that he surveyed expected to reduce their sales, and that was up about 14% since February. Um, and 13% expect significant revenue drops due to this. What was really interesting is that in the beginning of the year, 62% were positive about the upcoming year, and now 65% are pessimistic. It's the
Yeah.
worst thing they've seen since COVID.
Yeah, yeah, it's a real reversal in people's small businesses
Yeah.
attitudes about it because they don't know what to look at. That's certainly, yeah, and it's dramatic. It's really dramatic. Ed, got any thoughts on this substitution issue?
Well, I'm enjoying the conversation, but I really believe the uncertainty of this whole process is a real problem. People can't plan. Small businesses, if you're buying a lot of material overseas, how do you plan through the Christmas holidays for getting products in your door? It's so complex and there's so many moving parts, and I just don't know if our economy can sustain all this uncertainty.
Mm.
And I was reading today that the deal with England, our automakers are pretty upset about. They don't think it's fair.
Mm.
I didn't get all the details on it, but wow, that's kind of interesting because I thought it was going to be done for their benefit. So,
Well, that's yeah, that's the sale. We're going to sell you that that's going to be better, and of course, it will remain to be seen how some of this stuff really washes out.
Yes.
But it's and I think it's interesting, when we tend to want to talk about the big guys because the big guys, they have hugely complex businesses, but and they're big dollars. But how many products does say Ford have? I don't know, 10 or 15 products. But think about the average small business person. I mean, how many products do they have? If you're in a cupcake store, you've probably got 50 or 100 products. And so, what do you do if your flour goes up? What do you do if sugar? I mean, I can remember times when people were complaining about sugar, and all the bakeries were all upset because they're going to go out of business because sugar was going to go up 30%. Well, sugar is only, 3% or 2% or 1% of the product and the product cost. And so that was so negligible that prices barely went up, except for the psychological impact of, oh, they're going to go up, and so maybe I won't go buy my donut this morning, or maybe or the bakery just psychologically thinks they have to raise their price because some of their costs have gone up, and so maybe you do have some of those kinds of disjointed things. But for the most part, it's like you have to really stop and think about, okay, what's really happened behind the scenes. I don't know that small businesses really dig into that as much as maybe they could, because they tend not to be terribly analytical on some of this stuff. They kind of do it the same way they've always done it.
Mhm.
You know,
I
go
have an
ahead.
example for how it's impacting a small business. I'm finding out that some small businesses are taking this as an advantage, or some big businesses too, just to have a price increase.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Because they don't know the details, so they feel like, okay, everybody expects prices to go up. We're going to raise our prices.
Yeah.
And that was with a Fortune 500 company. And I also see it with smaller companies. They're starting to bill 3% extra for tariffs, and
Mm.
even think there's any justification for that.
Yeah, and that's a psychological increase. Maybe they go, "Oh yeah, okay." I have to replace the struts on my car, and my local mechanic is saying, it's this price. And I was pretty shocked at how expensive it was, and to do all of them. And I said, "Well, I'll tell you what, I'll bring it in, but if I wait 30 days, have any idea on price?" And he's like, "Hey, we do the work. We just charge you whatever the price is."
Right.
How do we know the price? It's when you bring the car in, we order the part.
Yeah.
Now, if the part goes up, you pay more. It's like, hey guy, this is not my deal. I'm the
Yeah.
mechanic here. And so you want the best price? Bring it in today and we'll give you a price. It's sort of like, because what can they do? And there's nothing wrong with that. So my reaction, it's like, well, gee, you're screwing me. Well, no, I mean, it's
Oh,
like,
yeah.
do I want to get my struts replaced or not? Or am I going to spend a bunch of time shopping all over town trying to find somebody who can say, oh, I can get a deal on the struts? Yeah, right.
Right. I
You
got,
know,
I've got this quote here from Adam Reza. He's the president of Sunscape Eyewear, and his concern is, he said, look, he said, we're importing stuff. And he says, the sad part is that we don't know what the price will be, and we have to pay it when it clears customs. So it really affects our cash flow. And imagine what it does for small businesses.
well, that's a very good point. And yeah, Ed, it's like you're trying to plan your cash flow, but you don't know what your purchases are going to be until it shows up at the dock.
Yeah.
We can deal with a lot of stuff, and small businesses are really good at adjusting. But when you don't know the rules, you don't know what's going to happen down the road, you're kind of out of luck. And we're not really good at predicting the future when we don't have any impact on those rules.
Yeah.
So part of that would be how long you expect the rules to last. Great Britain joined the European Union back in, I think, the 80s, maybe it was earlier. I don't have the time frame on it. But New Zealand, where I was living, the majority of the export of its primary produce, beef, dairy, milk, was going up into England, was a huge purchaser of that product. Well, overnight, Great Britain was then committed to buy from the other European countries and not from New Zealand. So the biggest
Because
market
they
that
were
New Zealand had,
they were part of the European Union at that point.
well, they became part of it. And so
Right.
New Zealand lost its biggest client.
Wow.
Well, The thing was, it wasn't going to change overnight. They quickly realized there was no mates deal to be made on the back end. So, nope, this is the way it's going to be. And so, because it was set in stone, and it still is set in stone today, New Zealand simply went out and went shopping. And they went to the largest market they could find, and they became a very major trading partner with China. In fact, the largest sale ever recorded in New Zealand's history was to China for the core material that goes into sports drinks, Coke, and all this stuff. It's the very bottom denominator of milk that you strip down whenever that you don't make cheese with it, you don't make other yogurt with it. You just strip it down, and the very core protein you ship out. And I think it was like a 70. It was a huge number, the biggest deal ever done. And so what happens after these things is you end up negotiating with new partners. Was that a good deal for New Zealand? No, it actually decimated their dairy production in many ways, and they got very little return on their investment. Point being is, I think a country can deal with it if they know that it's going to last. But you just go out and go shopping. But we don't know what's going to last.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, again, we've got 30% tariffs coming off today for some country. Then we may penalize them tomorrow. Whether we like tariffs or don't, the methodology that you use to try to get your way with it is what's causing the chaos.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. And it puts a lot of pressure on small businesses, particularly really tiny businesses. But then on the other hand, I think the toughest for the small businesses would be when you just completely lose a resource. And if it happens to be part of your manufacturing process, part of your service, and you no longer have it, you're in a world of hurt. If you can't get a part from a little machine that you're making at all, now you're in really, really big trouble and you're out of business. So then you can ask the question, was it really smart for you to do single sourcing? We wanted to get volume discounts, and so we had to buy it for that much money. Okay, you did. So you put 100% of your relationship with one company, and now that is gone. You might have paid a little bit more over the years, but you'd have at least 2 or 3 relationships. Was that a smart idea? So, I think it says to small businesses, don't forget to diversify. It may cost you a little bit more with lower volumes, but it adds a level or it reduces your risk in a way. I used to when I was doing a lot of work with retailers, I used to tell them on certain items, not in the fashion business necessarily, but like hardware stores, certain items, don't be out of these basic things that never go out of style. You don't want to be out of nails. And so if you have a lot of nails and you can sell them for many, many years, they may go up and down in terms of volume, but don't try and do it just in time here because you think the big guys are going to do just in time. You don't need to have your nails filled in once a week. But they do that. The little stores will go to their master supplier, Ace Hardware, whatever, and they just order by the week. They come in and they fill it in and they keep their inventory low. It's like, well, hey, wait a minute. Some items you want to make sure you have, and in volatile times, it makes a lot more sense. As a matter of fact, if everybody else is out of nails, guess what? You can raise your prices. I love to use an example of the hurricane. You guys have heard this before. The hurricane where everybody needed a generator. And so the generator stores were sold out, literally in hours. And so some of the hardworking guys said, oh, okay, I'll go get a bunch of generators. And they would drive trucks, 800 miles away, pick up a truckload and bring it back in, and they'd be resupplied the next day. And oh, my golly, those were worth more money the next day because you still have a hurricane on, so people still need them. And so you ended up making a whole bunch of money because you were fleet of foot and you knew where the inventory was and you made deals and you had relationships. small businesses have to recognize that it's required for them to keep your options open, to be aware of what's out there, to know your industry, to know your suppliers. You know, don't don't discontinue relationships with little suppliers just because you might not be doing very much with them now. That's the lifeblood of your business. And in this particular case where we have COVID and now this,
Yeah.
boy, it really matters to have the right amount of inventory or excess inventory in order to be able to do it. I used to, when I was in the retail business, I used to make a killing based on betting on that. You know, well, gee, if I were to buy double what I normally do, my warehousing costs are a little high, but I had a big warehouse, so my warehousing costs are a little bit higher. My carrying costs may be a little bit higher, but boy, I'll tell you, you know, if I need to have those, I'm going to sell them. And when everybody runs out of the product, my price is going to maybe go up a buck or two. And so I used to do really well buying truckloads of stuff that I knew would be good when it snowed, or that I
Yeah.
knew would be good when spring came or something like that. You know, so you don't do that with everything. But you know what? You make your money off of your high volume things that you know are key items. And you're only going to have 20% of your inventory are those key. 20% of your inventory is creating 80% of your business.
I wanted
Focus
to
on
piggyback.
20%.
I wanted to piggyback a little bit on what Ed was saying about the challenge of not knowing. And the CEO of Shoestring Kings, who gets all of his shoestrings from China, you know, said the 147% tariff has just knocked his business, you know, right out of the park. And one of the things he said, instead of focusing on growing on business and serving customers, we're spending hours recalculating costs and trying to predict what's happening next, you know, which is a terrible misuse of their limited funds and time.
Well said.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. Now, I've never been one to reduce the analytical time that I spend in the business, because I always felt that the more I knew, the smarter decisions that I could make. And so, you know, I really used to always focus on that, because I needed to know. I needed to know everything about every product. I needed to know the margins. I needed to know everything about it. And so now, if you're really, really small and you have to, you know, you're responsible for everything in your business, it's really tough. I've been there
Yeah.
several times. I know what that's like. But it doesn't mean that you should not use care to analyze your business. There are very few small businesses that, beyond hearing the term 80/20, there are very few small businesses who go through the exercise to determine what their best 20% of their products are. You know,
Ron, what's interesting about that conversation, if you're in a safety critical or a mission critical operation, you don't have one supply side and one solution to your service. You have at least two. And if you think you're in a really, you want to keep command of your market, you have three. And part of it is you may, you know, differentiate between the three of them by one being European, one being local, one being whatever. But you try to do that. I think the people that have really got hurt is, take the shoelace supplier. 100% of his business is from one country and one type of business. You know, to be fair, he knew this was coming. He's totally dependent on one political relationship, one marketing relationship. If he was smart, he would have had, I'm sure there's shoelace suppliers in Europe.
Yeah.
So I'm sure there's some in Southeast Asia, apart from China. Why didn't he have those?
that's right.
And so he's learned the lesson that a lot of us have learned, that you've got to have more than one supplier, and you certainly have to have things backed up and be aware of it. So, I mean, maybe the flip side of this, it's a good thing. I think 10 or 20% of businesses are going to be culled out. They'll go out of business.
Yeah.
And possibly, to be rude about it, they shouldn't have been in business. They were floating on the top of the surface and they were making a fast buck, and it was happening, and they didn't really realize they had to go and dig their oars in. Conversely, there's a couple of people who, because they've got a strong supply side, they'll be able to grow and be profitable despite that. And there'll even be some that don't pass on the price increases because they're going to absorb that of the cost of doing business for a period of time, understanding that it's going to fluctuate out and come down.
Right.
So they're not going to upset their clients in the short term for a long-term detriment.
And this goes back to really understanding your business. And I've talked about this. You guys are going to be tired of hearing it, but this is for the audience. And that is that if you don't understand the difference between your fixed and your variable costs, you don't know how to do your planning, and you don't know how to do your inventory, and you don't know what to do because you've got to, all of these moving things going on. If you focus on selling more of the same, that now you've shifted dollars into marketing and sales effort and that kind of thing, and there's nothing wrong with that. If you need more volume, the question is, how much more volume do you need in order to be able to survive this? And the answer is, I don't know. I make some money most months, and it's at this volume, and when my sales go up, I can make a little bit more money. Oh, sometimes I don't, but my sales are up. Well, that's because you don't understand what your marginal dollars are doing, and you don't understand the composition of margin to inventory categories. And if you don't understand, you make stupid decisions. So, just to kind of push back just a little bit, okay, can you overanalyze your business? And I'm sure there are people who may overanalyze it, but I'm telling you, if you don't understand the basics of how costs work, and only a teeny percent of small business people do understand what I'm talking about here, that's how you make mistakes. You buy too much of it, and you've got, or you buy a good deal, and it was 10 times as much as you would ever use, and you didn't plan on the obsolescence in that product. I mean, there's so many of these things, but you have to, and all these things you've suggested are terrific, because you have to keep your eye on all of them. But I would just say, not doing the analysis is not one of the things you should stop.
Yeah. Well, let me make another observation from the guy who did the sunwear. He said, one of the thoughts he had is, why is this not fair? He said, because why does Apple get a pass and we still have to make the payments?
Well, that's a
And
good
of course,
point.
that might have been a political issue, but the fact of the matter is, they get hurt and Apple doesn't.
That's right. And now we've been to politics a little bit, but I'll say it, and that is, when government picks winners, you got a problem.
Yeah.
And that the government is not entitled to pick winners. There's nothing in the Constitution about selecting certain industries or certain companies to be able to do certain things. So our government is amiss in that case. That doesn't mean that the small business person doesn't have to be aware of all of these issues and be able to adjust anyway. That's part of the fun and challenge and opportunity of small business, is to be able to be fleet of foot, recognize shifts in the marketplace, because you're watching patterns. If you're selling air conditioners, window air conditioners, you're going to sell more when it's hot. You've made those adjustments over the years. So, it's like all of these seasonal things, political things, import, export, cost differences, labor costs, they all have to be considered all the time. And good small business people are watching that all the time to make those adjustments. And you've all done it, but it's hard. It's hard.
Yeah, so I'm tagging along with it, but the thing is, we say we don't want to be political, so let's not be political. But the government is setting up the ground rules under which businesses can operate.
Yeah.
In America specifically, some of those ground rules were about groundwater. They were about disposal of waste.
Mm-hmm.
And there are industries that have been basically forced out of the country because the penalties for pollution, and I use the word pollution with inverted commas because, what is pollution, and what was the definition of pollution? The consequences were so high that those businesses opted not to even be subject to those laws. They would just leave because it was such a detriment to them to stay here. Now, the particular industry I'm talking about, I know extremely well, which is the printed circuit board industry. And the printed circuit board industry is a core industry for military, for automotive, for communications. It's one of the core industries for the way we live today.
Mhm.
And the very core of that industry, apart from semiconductors, is the circuit board industry. And that was forced out. 90% of manufacturing was forced out of this country by very, very strong laws concerning water quality and pollution and waste materials. Now, I'm not against having controls over the pollution that we put in, but let's go and isolate that and figure out ways of reducing it, making our waterways safe, which we need. However, all we did was we shipped the problem from here to Hsinchu province or wherever it is in Vietnam, Malaysia, or China. And in fact, they care less than we care. So they are polluting their stuff in a huge way.
Right.
So, where are we going? Oh, we're so good because we got rid of it from America. I'm sorry, guys. We also got rid of the manufacturing, and now we are dependent. Do you know how come, Apple managed to get manufacturing in China? Well, that's part of the reason, is it was such a heinous place to operate here in the US that Flextronics couldn't keep up with it. So they moved their facilities. Come on, guys.
Yeah.
It is intertwined with government control.
Well, it is, and I know you can't split them apart and just not do that, because whoever makes the rules is going to be, if it's politicians making the rules,
Right.
it's going to be political. I guess you're right about that. So
Well, they say them that make the rules make the gold.
yeah, that's right.
Well,
But
they move the gold. The gold gets moved by the rules they
Yeah,
make.
that's right.
Yeah. I guess if you're trying to fix, say, water quality and you set the rules, you're not picking and losing specific companies. And so when I'm talking about picking winners, it's
Yeah.
kind of like, that's what I object to. But yes, you have to make those kinds of decisions for pollution and whatever. We're going to find out very interestingly in a fairly short term here in California, because 2 of our refineries are shutting down this year. 2 of them. The projected increase is that we may have gas, and of course the media gets a hold of this. It'll be between maybe $7 and $8, somewhere. It's going to be high. Well, it's even worse than that, because I just happen to know that one of the biggest plants, Chevron, has not been allowed to upgrade or change their plant that manufactures gasoline here, that refines gasoline. That they are very close to being unprofitable, because they can't make the upgrades, and they haven't been allowed to, because California wouldn't allow them to do that. Now, California is just making the rules. They didn't do anything different for any other refineries. So you could argue they weren't picking winners. However, it's interesting. What you're saying, John, is absolutely, illustrated in spades here. And that is that when you set certain rules, you change the supply and demand curve. And so when you can't supply it at a profit, now you're going to have shortages. And then when you have shortages, you tend to have, especially in gas, you're going to have increases in price, because there's not enough and people are bidding more in order to buy it. So yeah, you're right. You guys are right. You can't really separate it.
Now, here's another take on this that I think is kind of one of the guys said that, this tariff from China, 147%, will increase their manufacturing costs to such an extent that they're going to have increases of 30 to 40%, which they can't pass on to their customers. So they're really squeezed in that way. That makes their decisions all the harder and forces so many small businesses out anyway. And maybe to John's point, maybe it's good that some of these people have left. They didn't belong there in the first place.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, this is a temporary thing, and they're gone. And when it's gone, they can't come back.
Yeah, no, that's true. And of course, that's just part of the problem in small business, is making enough money to handle growth, not putting yourself into too much debt, and being able to have plenty of cash to be able to make adjustments.
Right.
And it's hard for small business to do that, but that's sort of required in a case like this.
Let's look at the plastic bottle manufacturing companies. We got some experience there, right?
Yeah.
And they were totally impacted by China. and everything was being produced in China because China was producing it a lot cheaper, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it put pressure on the margins of US companies to be able to compete. And so a lot of them subsequently, unfortunately, have gone out of business and are having a very difficult time right now trying to have a break-even bottom line. So I think the purpose of this whole thing of tariffs is a good idea because we want to have our as much as possible produced in our country rather than relying upon other countries. But my gosh, the way it's being done and negotiated in public and all the uncertainty, it's very challenging. It's way above my labor grade, that's for sure.
Well, you're just underpaid. Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's very interesting, and I don't know. Is there one recommendation that each of you can throw out for small business on how to handle this very, very tough problem right now? No, we
I would
can't.
say for me that it's all about cost averaging and looking at a 1 year. I mean, the deal is it's going to change in the next 3 months. So I would look at alternative suppliers, and I'd also try to minimize the reactionary effects short term to be able to absorb some of it for a long term game. So the old 1 year, 5 year rule would probably come into effect. Whereas, is this going to put me out of business in 1 year? Then I probably need to look at something. If it's not going to put you out of business, you're just going to take a hit on your bottom line for a while. Let's say you take a hit, stay the course, see how it plans out, but also look for alternatives.
Good advice.
I would say that you need a strong balance sheet to weather the storm. And that was pretty much the same situation at COVID. So, and it's hard to develop a strong balance sheet overnight.
Yeah.
So, but that's how important a strong balance sheet is, to be able to survive the hiccups that can come up that you can't anticipate because you're not making the rules. You're just trying to survive.
Mhm.
And a lot of these changes that are going on aren't something that could have been forecasted
Yeah.
because the rules are being changed.
Yeah.
Mhm. Mhm.
And when the president said that other presidents didn't do this, I can kind of understand why.
Oh,
It's very challenging,
yeah,
right?
it is.
Yeah.
It's the right thing to do, but man, you're basically negotiating with every country separately.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And I heard somebody say in the negotiations that there were 20,000 lines in the British deal. 20,000
20,000 lines,
lines of
clarification.
yeah. I mean, they have teams of people reading this stuff,
Yeah.
negotiating stuff. Ray, a last word?
No, I just hope and pray that they make some decision that clarifies it so that small businesses will have a firm footing moving forward.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think we're all with you on that one. So, and I guess my statement would be, be careful not to do the same things that you've been doing. For instance, in pricing, be careful not to just take your standard markup on every single thing that comes in. Think carefully about, can you move it up? Can you move it up a little bit, but not take a full price increase? And of course, if you understand your margin dollars, which products can you go up on and which products should you stick the same on? But part of the thing that's very dangerous for small business people will be shrinking sales. And so if you have shrinking sales and you are raising prices, you're going back to the economic model and you're asking people not to buy as much. And you're going to have shrinking sales again. So try and shore that up and maintain some level of sales volume so you've got something to work with. if you end up with a 10 or 15 or 20 or 30% decline in your volume, boy, that's pretty difficult to deal with for more than a, maybe, well, terrific balance sheets, might make that, but you're going to start losing money really quick, and it's going to be pretty big numbers if you have those kinds of declines. And so you've got to be careful not to erode your dollar sales very much. And then you also have the side issue, and that is you lose customers.
Yeah.
And you don't want to lose customers. You want to find substitutions for those customers so they stay loyal to you.
So what you said just now, Ron, is basically what we're seeing in the stock market. Because everybody's trying to analyze how all this is going to impact the cash flows of all these big companies.
Yeah.
So that's why when you turn it on, there's a lot of uncertainty.
Yeah.
And people getting upset, and when your 401k plan that you're planning for retirement goes down 20% overnight, people
Yeah.
get concerned.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure it's a good political avenue to pursue. I'm concerned about that because there's a lot of downside on it, and a lot of people upset
Yeah.
and worried. They're
No,
really worried.
that is certainly true. And it needs to be reconciled fairly quickly, I think. I don't think people
Mhm.
can, people will tire of this pretty shortly, in, I don't know,
I
3
think
6
they're
months.
already tired.
Yeah, I
Well,
think they're already tired.
yeah, maybe. It's a tough thing to have to do after COVID. Um, on the other hand, and here's a political statement. I think it had to happen. I think that our trade circumstance was such that we didn't have anywhere to go up anymore, and this could blow up in our faces. But when it's done, at least we may see an upside because we see such a big downside. I don't know. I don't know if it could be that bad, but we'll all hope for the very best. And gosh, good luck to all of you. Hope some of these ideas will help some of you out there. And we will all see you in a week or so. Thanks very much.